The doorbell rang hard enough to rattle the peephole, and when I opened it, two men in navy uniforms with shiny badges and tactical belts were already stepping over the threshold like the place belonged to them. One barking that I was under arrest and the other reaching for my wrists the way you reach for a thing, not a person. And in the half-second before my heartbeat caught up to my body, I saw three details that told me everything I needed to know. The patch's stitching didn't match. The nameplates were generic. Tony and Rick like Halloween props, and the older white guy planted in the sidewalk with a clipboard and a nasty smirk was the same. HOA hardliner who had been sending us letters since the day we moved in, the kind of letters that start with community standards and end with property values, the kind that pretend rules are neutral, while always finding a way to land on the same kinds of families. My hands went up because I was a black man in my own doorway with two supposed officers crowding me. And if you know how quickly a normal afternoon can go wrong, how fast a misunderstanding can turn into a memorial. "Arrested for what?" I asked, voice steady because you learn steady young, and clipboard cleared his throat like he was the judge and the choir. "Fraud, threats operating without a permit, and obstruction," he announced, loud enough for neighbors to hear, and I could feel the cul-de-sac lean toward us. Faces behind blinds, phones sliding up to record. The quiet little theater that always sets up when black folks become someone else's lesson about order. The taller fake cop snapped a cuff around my wrist. The metal bit my skin before my brain allowed me to flinch. And that's when Sandra came around the corner from the kitchen, still in her house t-shirt and bun. A black woman who spent her week juggling students and lesson plans and a mother with blood pressure alarms. The woman who watches baking shows to turn the volume down on the world. She took in the scene like a camera. My arm twisted, the wrong embroidery, the HOA guy's smug certainty, and something in her whole body changed, the air around her shifting from soft to steel. "Gentlemen," she said, and it wasn't a question, it was a stop sign. "Step back from my husband." The shorter one laughed because he'd already decided who we were. He had that bored look people wear when they're sure they've got the ending. "Ma'am, you don't want to interfere," he said, and then the tall one tugged my arm like I was a rope he'd been told to pull. Sandra moved. It happened fast, muscle memory fast. She pivoted, trapped the chain, rolled my shoulder free without yanking me, and in the same motion reached into the inside pocket of her denim jacket and flipped open a worn leather wallet that caught sunlight in a way no prop ever could. The badge hit my eyes before the letters did, but the letters hit the men like a blow. United States, Marshal Service. Identification card laminated, seal raised, photo of the same woman standing in our doorway with a look that had gotten fugitives to put down weapons in counties that don't make the evening news. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Sandra Reed," she said, calm and cold. "You will take your hands off my husband and produce your credentials, agency, precinct, and commanding officer, right now." Tony's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Rick's eyes flicked toward the HOA guy like a kid looking for permission. Clipboard blanched and tried to smile, the kind of smile people use when they've just realized they brought a fork to a thunderstorm. "This is a civil matter," he started, voice wobbling. "We have community authority." "Community authority is not state law," Sandra said without raising her voice. "State law is not federal authority, and impersonating an officer is a felony. Move." The cuffs were off my wrist before the sirens even arrived, because Sandra had already keyed a push-to-talk on the radio, clipped to a charger by our foyer table, the one that looks like a Bluetooth speaker until it isn't, calling in a 1034 with possible false imprisonment and requesting marked units to clear. It took the HOA guy 3 sentences to try the oldest trick, softening his tone, calling me buddy, explaining how this was all a misunderstanding. How folks like you sometimes don't realize the process, how no one wanted trouble, and every syllable landed like the dust of a road I'd walked too many times. A road where rules move around your body like heat mirages until the moment numbers stop them. Because this entire mess hadn't begun with fake badges. It started weeks earlier with a deck, a measuring tape, and the slow, familiar creep of bias wrapped in bylaws. I'd built the deck to code, a gift for Sandra on our anniversary. a cedar rectangle that smelled like mornings I wanted us to have, and before the stain had dried, we got our first notice. Unauthorized height variance of 6 inches, $200 per day until remediation. 6 inches, a number that can be anything if you tilt a ruler. Our contractor, a guy named Michael with easy banter and 5-star reviews, swore he'd double-checked the municipal code. Our permit read 38 inches max. The deck sat at 36. He brought out the laser in front of me, right there on the boards, red line steady at 36.0, and still the letters kept coming, non-compliant, escalating, liens considered. In the grocery store parking lot, the HOA president, Teresa, a white woman with pastel sweaters and the eyes of somebody who likes picking teams, told me she just wanted our neighborhood to remain safe and beautiful, which I've learned often translates to compliant and quiet. And her smile tightened when I said I'd be appealing. People talk about microaggressions like gnats. This was a swarm. A neighbor I'd never met snapping photos over our fence. A courtesy visit from community security that ended with them peering into our yard like they were counting someplace we didn't belong. A flyer slipped under our mat about maintaining property standards so families feel comfortable. Which families? Which comfort? I kept a folder because folders are shields. Dates, photos, code printouts with highlighted sections, and still the fines stacked like bricks. We thought it was petty until the afternoon I found a notice stamped asset recovery with language so dramatic it sounded like a threat in legal drag. Michael looked spooked when I showed him. 3 families this year, he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. All corner lots, all with additions. They ended up moving. He offered a discount to trim the posts to make the fight go away. I said we weren't cutting a single board. That's when I caught the first whiff of something intentional. An overnight tow by mistake, storage fees payable in cash, our car reappearing with a fresh scrape and a tiny, neat chalk mark on the tire like someone had tallied us. We kept it moving because you keep it moving when you're trying to live. But bias doesn't like being ignored. It wants a scene. And now the scene had arrived at my door in a pair of bargain basement uniforms. Teresa showed up mid-standoff wearing power pearls and piety. "Marshal, there's no need to escalate," she said. Palms out like a mediator, but her eyes tracked the neighbors gathering on the sidewalk, and I could see the narrative she wanted. Disruptive black homeowner. Brave HOA protecting the community, unfortunate misunderstanding resolved by stern policies. Sandra didn't give her oxygen. "Tony, Rick," she said, reading their plates like a teacher taking attendance. "Set the duty belts on the porch and sit on the curb. Hands where I can see them now." They obeyed because real authority doesn't scream. She turned to Teresa. "We'll get to you in a minute, Ms. Edwards." Teresa flinched at her last name delivered like evidence. Real sirens swung around the corner then, city blue whites, 2 units with body cams already rolling. And if you've never felt the relief of real procedure brushing aside counterfeit theater, it's like the first breeze after a hot day. The officers recognized the badge, radioed confirmation, and took statements with a professionalism that made our porch feel like a courtroom. Sandra asked one of them to call the state licensing board to verify whether any auxiliary police program had authority in our subdivision. Negative. She asked another to run the patches vendor printed on Tony and Rick's uniforms. Online marketplace. Meanwhile, she opened our garage, snapped a photo of the deck plans pinned to the wall, and pulled the manila folder I'd been feeding. "Numbers don't care about opinions," she murmured, eyes scanning VINs, permit numbers, notice dates. "Numbers build maps." Teresa tried another tack. "We treat everyone the same," she announced, loud for the crowd. But a neighbor across the street coughed so hard with disbelief she had to look away. Mrs. Wilson, a retired teacher with the kind of gaze that flattens foolishness, stepped to the edge of her lawn. "Everyone," she said. "Then why is every family you find in the last year either black, Latino, immigrant, or new? Why did you tell me to call the tow on that car because it didn't look like it belonged? Which car didn't belong, Teresa? The Camry with the car seats? Or the Audi with HBCU plates?" The street went quiet in that way that means truth just walked through. Teresa stammered about standards. Sandra's radio crackled. The state licensing board confirmed no agency match for those badges. while the city dispatch advised that a complaint had already been filed against our HOA about discriminatory enforcement patterns. Someone else had been watching. Sandra gestured to the officers. Go ahead and take the uniforms in for questioning on impersonation and attempted unlawful detention, she said, then turned to Teresa with a look I'd seen only once before, on the news, when Marshals brought in a guy who'd been hurting girls for years. As for you, Sandra continued, you're going to bring me every document authorizing your actions against my husband's property, bylaws, votes, permits, correspondence, with original signatures. And when you're done, you're going to explain why this community security was paid out of a slush fund your board never disclosed. Teresa tried to bolt. She made it 2 steps before an officer stepped into her path. Her voice rose into the pitch of someone who's lost control but thinks volume can substitute. This is persecution, she cried. You people always make everything about race. Sandra didn't flinch. You made it about race the moment you decided our compliance would be interpreted as guilt and your certainty would be interpreted as law. While the officers worked, Sandra moved through our living room with a speed that meant she'd been assembling this puzzle for days. She pulled our deck file, cross-checked the fine dates with HOA board minutes she'd quietly FOIA'd last week after the toe scrape, and stacked the patterns into a timeline that even the neighbors could understand. Every family targeted had one of 3 things in common: a corner lot with high resale potential, a recent improvement that could be nitpicked into non-compliance, and a last name that made O-like mouths on certain board members. When the officers finished cuffing Tony and Rick, who looked thoroughly spooked now that the play acting had turned into paperwork, Sandra called her supervisor. She stepped into the kitchen, spoke low, and came back with a different kind of focus. I'm off duty, she said to me, but an assistant U.S. attorney I trust is looping in the county DA. If this scheme touches mail, wire, or interstate fraud, we'll help the locals run it down. In the next hour, a small field office bloomed on our porch. Officer tablets uploading body cam footage, a sergeant canvassing neighbors, Sandra logging photographs into a chain of custody note like she'd been born writing them. Michael drove up then, eyes wide, cheeks pale. He looked at Teresa and then at the cuffs on the floor, and I could see the calculation finishing in his head. I can explain, he said too quickly. She told me it was safety. She told me, save it for your statement, Sandra said, not unkindly. Bring your contracts, your emails, and your tax forms. And if you lied on any of them, now is a great time to stop. He sagged like a tent after a storm and nodded. Later at the station, the picture sharpened like a lens getting dialed in. Teresa had used her presidency like a lever, identifying target properties they could flip fast. Michael would discover issues a tape measure couldn't find, and the board would flood families with fines until they sold low. A friendly investor, an LLC that traced back to Teresa's cousin, would swoop in, buy, and relist for a clean profit. It was fraud sprayed with vanilla. It was racism dressed in khakis. It worked because people assume paperwork is proof, and because families like ours learn early that loud rooms aren't built for us. When the detectives finished, we drove home in a quiet that felt less like shock than a coast after a hill. The porch smelled like summer again. Sandra's hand brushed my cuff-reddened wrist, and she winced the way you wince when you see a bruise on someone you love and didn't prevent. I should have told you sooner, she said, voice small for the first time since the doorbell. I thought it was petty, just HOA noise, and I didn't want to bring work home. But when the toe happened, I started looking and the pattern was ugly. She hesitated. I went under once before on a small-town case. It makes you paranoid about showing your badge until you must. I told her the truth, that even though she'd just saved the day, I was still shaking, and not only from the cuffs. Shake from the what-ifs, from the faces at the blinds, from the galling ease with which a man with a clipboard had tried to narrate my life. I know, she said. That's why I didn't wait today. I've seen how quickly a story can be written around a black man's body. She called my mother before dinner because she knew. Ma would see the porch video online and explode through the phone if she heard anything secondhand. She spoke to her with the particular tenderness they share, the one built on a decade of holidays and casseroles and the way Sandra sits with Ma when the blood pressure cuffs beep. I grilled chicken I barely tasted, and we ate on the deck like we were reclaiming it one bite at a time. That night, the neighborhood group thread lit up with apologies and "I didn't knows," and a long, quiet thank you from Mrs. Wilson, who admitted she'd tried to raise concerns for a year and was called dramatic. A father down the street texted that his black teen son had been followed by community volunteers twice. He'd stopped complaining because fines come faster when you speak. The next morning, the DA held a press conference on the clubhouse lawn. The charges read like a list of things people think can't happen on a cul-de-sac. Conspiracy, wire fraud, impersonation, false imprisonment, civil rights violations under color of law. Tony and Rick took pleas. Michael agreed to cooperate, which made Sandra snort because men like him always find their conscience exactly one courtroom too late. Teresa tried one last performance, crying, blaming outsiders, calling the investigation a witch hunt, but numbers don't cry and paper doesn't blink. The county auditor released a summary showing who was fined, when they sold, and how much profit the LLCs made after beautification. If you mapped the addresses, the red pins made a pattern that looked too much like the history book pages everyone pretends not to remember. The board resigned en masse. Mrs. Wilson was elected interim president in a vote that felt like a neighborhood exhale, and the first thing she did was remove the Community Standards Patrol language from the bylaws and institute an explicit non-discrimination policy with teeth. She called Sandra and asked for help drafting a consent policy so no one with a clipboard could step into a yard without written permission. A month later, after depositions, after hearings, after a chain of meetings where people who'd never said hello confessed what they'd seen and hadn't known how to name, restitution checks began landing in mailboxes. Ours covered the tow, the storage, the legal bills, and something intangible the memo called distress, which made me snort because a line item for fear will never feel like enough. But it was the closest a system could come to acknowledging a bruise under a cuff. The story went regional, because people like HOA drama when it smells like schadenfreude, and reporters asked me what it felt like to have a U.S. Marshal for a wife. I told them the truth. It felt like safety and anger and pride and a mirror, because the same badge that scared two fakes into sitting on a curb should never have been required for me to be believed in my own doorway. Sandra turned down a TV spot. "I'm not here to perform," she said. Instead, she spent her evenings helping Mrs. Wilson organize a listening night on the green. Folks brought lawn chairs and lemonade, and for 2 hours we did the slow work of community. A Latina nurse talked about being warned she'd better not host quinceañeras in the clubhouse. An older white couple admitted they'd assumed the fines must be justified because the board wouldn't. I then trailed off and apologized. A Ghanaian engineer explained how it feels to be a first in your cul-de-sac and a suspect in your driveway. I told them what it's like to have your wrist grabbed in your home and calculate 6 ways to survive it. We ended by painting a little library bright yellow and stenciling 3 words on its side: "Rules need people." The deck that started it all became the place where we hosted what Mrs. Wilson called the Good Trouble BBQ. Kids ran sprinklers through August light. I taught a teenager how to change a tire because his father had been working doubles to pay fines that no longer existed. Sandra ran a mini clinic on Know Your Rights and Document Like a Pro, showing neighbors how timestamps, serial numbers, and polite insistence build shields stronger than speeches. On the anniversary of the day the fake cops tried to step into our home, we sat on the steps with paper plates and full hearts. Teresa had pled out. Michael was speaking to church groups about how easy profit can rot you. Tony and Rick were picking up trash in orange vests along the arterial, learning the difference between a prank and a felony the clean way. Sandra leaned into me, head on my shoulder, and for once the breeze sounded like a plain old breeze, not another shoe dropping. "You all right?" she asked. "Getting there," I said. "Still mad sometimes. Still seeing that smirk when I close my eyes." She squeezed my hand. "Me too. We'll keep the file thick anyway." I laughed because she knew me. We made a new folder labeled "For Good," copies of the new bylaws, a list of neighbors willing to show up if anyone's ever singled out again, a photo of Sandra holding her badge while 2 fake cops sat on the curb looking like men who'd learned a lesson late, and a handwritten note from Mrs. Wilson that read simply, "Thank you for not letting them tell us who we are." When we finally turned in, the house felt like ours in a way it hadn't since the notices began. No one lurking behind a rule book. No one deciding which families belong. I slept hard and woke to sunlight on cedar and the smell of coffee Sandra makes like a love letter. And if sometimes, in the quiet between sirens and laughter, I replay that half-second when metal bit skin and imagine the alternate versions of the day, the ones that end on T-shirts and GoFundMes. I also replay the way Sandra's voice cut the script, the way numbers marched instead of opinions, the way a badge in the right hand is not a cudgel but a key. People say the story ends with arrests and checks and policy, but I don't think so. I think the real ending is a beginning. A neighborhood deciding it will be curious instead of certain. A board that has to answer to the people it serves. A black couple sitting on a deck they refuse to shrink. Telling their granddaughter someday that when trouble knocked in a costume, they opened the door, told the truth, and watched the costume fall to the ground. If you like this story, hit that like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more HOA tales and real-life neighborhood drama each week.